Well, the Supreme Court issued two key rulings today, both of them having to do with the president's financial records. So we're going to bring in Paula Reid to talk a little bit more about this, having both a legal background and so also covering the White House. So you are perfect for this. Paula, let us kind of break down the two cases, and we'll start with the one that had to do with congressional subpoenas. Three different congressional committees are investigating the president, and the subpoenas were not for the president. They were for financial institutions that he and his companies have been dealing with.
Exactly. They were for accountants and banks, and that was a good strategy because they knew if they ultimately prevailed at the Supreme Court, which they did not, they have not, they wouldn't have to risk the president further dragging this out by refusing to hand over these documents. These requests have been tailored to these specific businesses that have always said they will comply with whatever the final court ruling was. But as you noted, today the Supreme Court said that House Democrats don't have the power to make these specific requests. In this case, the court was really balancing Congress's need to conduct oversight with protecting the president from sort of politically motivated investigations and sort of nuisance requests. And here the court has said, actually, you're looking right now, you're saying to hush money payments to women who had affairs with the president before he was in office. Also questions about whether he inflated his assets to reduce his tax liability or fraudulently get loans. And the court has ultimately decided that they do not have the authority to do this.
And then the other case was a criminal case. It's coming out of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And once again, they were pursuing his financial documents essentially from the same institutions. So let's talk about that, because in this case, the president, and the argument was that this is part of the investigatory process. They're investigating the president. They're not charging him. What was the conclusion of the court?
That's right. This is part of a grand jury investigation into the Trump organization and the president and any role they may have had in trying to cover up these hush money payments to women ahead of the election, questions about whether those were properly disclosed, potentially campaign finance violations. And the president's lawyers argued once again, they said, look, we can't have state and local prosecutors requesting things from the president, investigating him in these criminal proceedings, because he could again be subject to potentially politically motivated investigations. Well, they did not prevail on that argument before the Supreme Court. They ruled that, in fact, the president is not above the law and that the Manhattan district attorneys and the grand jury can continue to pursue this. But they left a little bit of wiggle room, Anne-Marie, and I was just texting with one of the president's lawyers, Jay Sekulow, and he sees both of these cases together as a win. And that's significant because he tells me that they're pleased that the decisions today have temporarily blocked Congress and New York prosecutors from obtaining the president's financial records. We will now proceed to raise additional concerns and legal issues in lower courts. The translation there, Anne-Marie, is that they saw a little wiggle room. They saw that the court said, well, there could be other issues that they raise that'll block this subpoena, but the president isn't immune from all state subpoenas. And that, to the president's lawyers, is a win because they can continue to litigate. They can continue to drill down and make arguments which will likely delay any final decision on handing over these documents until after November 2020. And for that reason, that really is a win. I will note, though, these were not going to be publicly released. They were either going to be released to the House Democrats and or the grand jury. And while they're not supposed to be made public, there was a very high risk of these leaking ahead of this very contentious upcoming election.
Yeah, I think that's really good to point out that the grand jury process is supposed to be secret. So should anything be released to the grand jury, the likelihood of the public seeing it, it's supposed to be slim. Different, of course, when it comes to the congressional committees, as you have pointed out before, things can get really, really leaky. Yeah, exactly. So a big question is, how is the White House responding? I have taken a peek at the president's Twitter account. I looked and there were 3 tweets, and then I looked again probably just a handful of minutes later, and there were a whole lot more than 3 tweets. So what's the response that you're getting?
There's been no shortage of tweets today. And actually, Anne-Marie, they started before the decisions. The president was laying the groundwork. He was tweeting about presidential harassment, prosecutorial misconduct, all really mirroring some arguments that the president's attorneys made in these cases. Then when he got this decision, particularly the first decision, which was a loss, he really just went off on Twitter, talking about a variety of grievances that he, the most powerful man on earth, has against the system, the justice system. He suggested that the courts in New York are rigged. He suggested that the federal investigators, the FBI, the Justice Department, the federal courts have also been unfair to him. He suggested that the Supreme Court has traditionally granted broad deference to presidents, which is true. But as we've seen with President Nixon, it's not absolute. So the president is really airing these grievances that we've heard repeatedly during all of his legal entanglements, that he believes, Anne Marie, even if two of his hand-picked justices ruled against him and also ruled for him, even if he's referring to investigations that were opened by his hand-picked attorney general, overseen by his hand-picked deputy attorney general, he still argues that the system is rigged against him, and there is something inherently unfair about everything that has happened to him in terms of these legal proceedings.
And of course, these decisions have different implications in sort of different realms, if you will. I just want to sort of go back to the first case that we brought up about the congressional committee investigations. And the concern was that this would have a long-term impact, depending on how the court decided, on the oversight abilities of Congress. One of Congress's primary roles is to conduct oversight over the president. Can we talk about the implications of this decision? Is this going to curtail Congress's oversight powers?
No, not necessarily, but their powers are not absolute. This White House has done a pretty extraordinary job of stonewalling most of the requests for documents or interviews that have come their way, particularly from House Democrats. So even if they have these powers, if the White House does not necessarily want to cooperate and they're not in charge, they're not in control, whatever party is pursuing these requests, of the Senate as well, they're going to have a tough time. Now, specifically with this request, this is not an area of the law where there's a ton of jurisprudence. There's not a lot of case law on this. There is some, but nothing that was really on point. So going forward, these kind of requests are going to need to be tailored differently, or they may have to come up with different avenues to try to get this specific kind of information from sitting presidents for this specific kind of oversight request.
And of course, the other area where there are implications has to do with politics. And you pointed out that his attorney Sekulow had said that this, felt like this was a win for them because at least even though the court did not side with the president's argument in the Manhattan-based case, Sekulow felt like they would be able to sort of go back to the lower courts and keep this thing up in the air till well past the election, which is really what the president would want to do. But then there is like this whole issue about his tax returns. In 2016, it was like a really big deal. But since then, even though people have continued to call for his tax returns or more information about his financial investments and dealings, he doesn't seem to be offering up anything. And I don't know how many voters care enough to make this a campaign issue this time around.
Our polling suggests that the responses fall sharply along partisan lines. The president has given a variety of explanations about why he doesn't make these public, saying he's under audit, again, suggesting presidential harassment. The question is, if you have not committed any crimes, if there's no evidence of civil or criminal misdeeds, why wouldn't you offer more transparency to clear your name, to clear the name of your organization, sort of get these people off your back? I mean, that question continues to linger out there and will continue to sort of follow him. Now, whether that has actual repercussions for him in November 2020, it seems like most people right now are not focused on the president's financial dealings. They are focused on his handling of coronavirus, his handling of the economic fallout from that, and also his handling, arguably mishandling, of this larger conversation about our racist past in this country. And how the president has handled those issues is really likely what will define his success or failure in November, not necessarily his transparency on financial documents.
So speaking of how the administration is handling the coronavirus, the president said the other day that he would be pressuring states to open up schools for this fall. He had been critical of the CDC's guidelines for school reopening. He tweeted out his criticism. And then we heard that perhaps the CDC was rewriting those guidelines. And then I thought I heard the CDC said, we're not rewriting them, we're offering additional information. What exactly is going on?
Well, Anne Marie, as we know, we've had many conversations during coronavirus, and I have said that the one constant here at the White House throughout the COVID pandemic has been mixed messages. And it is perplexing why the president and his medical experts can't go behind closed doors and come out with one coherent message. Because yesterday, the vice president said he spoke with the president about the CDC guidelines. The president came out, tweeted that he disagreed with them. Shortly thereafter, there was a task force briefing. The vice president said there'd be new guidelines. And as you noted earlier today, the CDC chief said, well, there's not going to be new guidelines, but there may be additional modifications or suggestions. And it leaves anyone who would like to use any of this guidance ultimately confused about where they're supposed to look, if they're supposed to wait for additional information. And this is arguably one of the biggest issues. And it's significant because throughout most of the pandemic, the Trump administration has deferred to local leaders on how to reopen their communities. But when it came to schools, the president is really taking the lead. He's saying that he is, quote, putting pressure on governors. He's threatened to cut funding, which is a little confusing because schools are mostly locally funded. But he's really pulling out all the stops to pressure people to do this. And the question is why? Why, when it comes to schools, is that such an important issue to the president? Well, I spoke with a White House advisor who said the president knows that getting people back to work means you first have to get kids back to school so that parents can go back to work and potentially give the president the economic resurgence that he thinks is necessary to propel him to victory in November 2020. But it is so difficult to make those critical decisions if even the CDC, where many people are looking, you don't know whether or not to trust the information that they're giving out on this issue.
Yeah, indeed. I feel like it's almost a little Groundhog Day-ish. I feel like we've had this conversation about other areas related to the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Hey, Paula, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.